Yeah, I mean, spine registries this is typically the response of the audience when they say they're going to talk about spine registries. So I hope that at the end of my talk, you guys aren't looking like this. What I'm going to try and do is give you some insights into the difficulties of developing a spine registry, but the real critical importance of putting that effort in. And I'm going to give you our experience at Vancouver and then across the Canadian Spine Outcomes Research Network, which is across 18 sites in Canada. I'm going to spend most of my time just talking about the structure of a registry, data collection and reporting, and data quality and applications, but obviously there's some other issues then that are more pertinent to a local environment, such as legal issues, sustainability or funding, and governance and policy. With the a question that was posed earlier about financing of registries, I would say that any and all of those stakeholders should be encouraged to be involved in the funding of a registry, because any and all of those stakeholders have something to gain from a properly performed registry. So when we look at the clinical utility of registries in spine care, there are some critical issues around what makes a good quality registry. It's got to be prospective. You should have buy-in. It should be specific to the disease that you're interested in. You should perform the registry long enough to get outcomes that are actually clinically meaningful. And what are the uses of a registry? Well, you can understand the natural history of a disease. You can look at the effective interventions. You can look at the disparity in care across, in Canada, at least in provinces or across the nation. You can look at clinical and cost effectiveness, and all those questions can be answered with a well-structured and well-used registry. And some registries already exist, so Spine Tango for the European spine groups, and the SCOPE registry here in Washington State, and there are many other examples. But what I want to talk to you about is our Canadian experience across, as I said, 18 sites. And you'll see that 85% of the Canadian population actually wants to live in the US, because they all live within 100 kilometres of the border. Since October of 2012, when we started our registry, we've now got over 8,000 patients. And I'll just give you a brief look at the type of data that's collected and some of the outcomes and studies that we've performed based on this registry. So what are the nuts and bolts of a spinal registry? Well, you have to have a strong mandate. You have to have a driven passion for the registry with a clear objective. And you have to have a mandate similar to Julius Caesar when he was crossing the Rubicon. And what I mean by that is, if you're going to go down the road of having a spine registry, you almost have to treat it like a military exercise, like an act of war. You have to be completely prepared, completely bought in. All your stakeholders have to be involved. You have to pre-plan it, and you have to have commitment from everybody from the start to the finish, because if you don't, it's doomed to fail. And once you start on a registry, there's really no going back, because you've got buy-in from all those stakeholders, and you've demonstrated, at least in your initial discussions, that that registry is important for a proper evaluation and transparent evaluation of clinical outcomes. I would say that you really carefully need to choose those who lead your registry. Though they should be statesmen or women, well respected, who'll deliver care and monitor it for a long time. And we wanted this guy for our Canadian registry, but we got this guy, Charles Fisher, my senior colleague. You should have clear defined objectives, roles and responsibilities for your registry, and your registry centralization should be separate from obviously all the participating sites, and the responsibilities of each of those sites is different. Your mission statement should be clear, and for the Canadian Spine Society Outcomes Research Network, our mission statement was to work with others to create a global culture of transparent data collection and creating, for us at least, a Canada-wide repository of information. And then there's no point in collecting that information unless you honestly disseminate that information such that it provides education and improved quality of care. So I want to give you our Canadian perspective, which is often different from the United States perspective, but I think it will give you some insights into the important stumbling blocks, but also opportunities that are involved in spine registries. So for us, the Canadian Spine Outcomes Research Network, we defined clear objectives for the central repository of the registry. Systematically collect the data, aggregate and validate that data, analyze it, give regular feedback to all the sites that are participating, and use that for both continuous education, for evaluation of performance, and to observe if there are clear changes in practice across a state, a province, or a country. And then for the individual hospitals or sites that are participating in that endeavour, they have to develop local databases. You must have a clearly marked lead person locally who will take the responsibility and the initiative for running that registry. You collect the data on, at least make an attempt to collect the data on all patients, but at least over 80%. And then you should regularly validate the quality of that data. Because if you're not collecting quality data from the start, then you might as well not collect any data at all. You should regularly export to the central repository or the registry, and to start you should agree on a minimum data set. And for us in the Canadian Spine Society, it took 3.5 years to come to consensus as to what the minimum data sets would be ever before we collected data on a single patient. And that was time so well spent because it meant that you had buy-in from all those who were involved. You clearly defined what your goals were going to be. And then there was no case of where you were 1 year or 18 months down the road collecting data and then said, oh, I wish we had thought of this, or I wish we had collected this piece of data. So spending the time and making the effort at the get-go to ensure that you're collecting the appropriate data. So we collect minimum data on enrollment in clinical assessment, complications, baseline data collection, both pre-surgery and post-surgery, and also for patients who are treated non-surgically, then essentially natural history data and follow-up. It's critical if you're going to have a registry that you partner with, because that's easier, than create a specialist database partner. So somebody who has the technological ability and has the capability and the platform that you can use for the collection of that data. And we were particularly lucky in Canada that the Rick Hansen Spinal Cord Injury Registry was established 3 years before we developed our Canadian Spine Outcomes Research Network. And they had a goal of developing a global research platform that would be a repository for the collection of outcomes data on patients with traumatic spinal cord injury. It started out as a Canada-wide initiative, but now it's an international initiative, ultimately trying to facilitate best practice and care for patients with traumatic spinal cord injury. But the same 18 sites that are involved in the Canadian Spine Society also have Rick Hansen Registry data collection systems. And so for us, it was the ideal platform to utilize for our outcomes network. They provide the technological backup and the central repository, and that relationship is critical. They also have similar interests in that they want to look at a unique population of patients with traumatic spinal cord injury. And obviously, as the care providers, we can provide them with expert context, and the interactions with that group allows development and improvement for both. You should consider, if you're developing a registry, to start with a pilot site to prove concept that this can be done. And so in 2008, our site at Vancouver was essentially the pilot site to look at the ability to roll this out and to try and overcome the initial obstacles, identify the cracks in the system that could be modified before a more national rollout. So we introduced a spine adverse event severity collection system, so a robust prospective collection of adverse events for all spine patients. And that's undergone multiple iterative processes over the years. And if you are involved in registry work, you'll know that it has to undergo those iterations of quality improvement over time in order to answer the questions you want answered, to collect the data that you want collected. And so we initially published in 2011 on our experience with this. And one of the most striking things about the use of this registry and the transparency with which the information was transmitted was that we reported complication rates that were 4, 6, sometimes 10 times what had been reported for similar patient populations in historical literature. And that was because of the use of a prospective system with a clear objective to identify complications and then transparently disseminate that information. We repeated that same system with our colleagues in Copenhagen in an effort to demonstrate that a prospective system like this is not unique to one site, but rather transferable across countries and indeed continents. If you're going to develop a system like this, again, you must spend time ensuring its reliability and validity. And all the benefit, or one of the critical benefits that we found of this registry was that we were able to identify clinically meaningful risk factors or associations between disease and outcome or between comorbidities and complications that retrospective hospital-based database systems could not do. And if you want to advocate for your patients, if you want to advocate for funding for your unit, it's really important that you bring this information to the table and demonstrate that the hospital-based systems that don't have the clinical context, that don't have the specificity of the question, that don't have the leadership of those who are providing clinical care, often will miss the target as far as particularly identifying patient risk factors. And we've been able to demonstrate the significant cost of multiple or single or multiple complications or adverse events. And again, that's powerful information to use for advocacy, for ongoing funding of your registry, for improvement of care, for identifying gaps in care, perhaps we call it quality improvement initiatives, and being able to argue that those should be funded based on a cost reduction of adverse events. There are many advantages to a registry like this because it can produce multiple publications that creates an atmosphere of a want to do this type of research and a want to disseminate this type of information. But more importantly, or equally importantly, I would say, is it allows units, states, provinces, even countries to develop quality initiatives to improve care based on gaps in care that have been identified with prospective registry data collection. So for instance, in Vancouver, we demonstrated that the two most common causes for reoperation during index hospital admission in spine patients was either a surgical site infection or hardware malposition requiring revision. So if we could focus on these two critical events and identify risk factors for those and reduce our surgical site infection rate and reduce our screw malposition rate, we would significantly improve not only patient care, but significantly reduce cost. So using a framework for evaluation of surgical safety, we identified key risk factors for the development of surgical site infection. And then we tried to identify which of those were modifiable and then make those changes and see if they led to a resultant decrease in surgical site infection. We identified that the actual surgical approach made a significant difference to infection rate. So a midline approach to the lumbar spine had an infection rate of 3 or 4%, but a Wilsey muscle splitting approach offered the opportunity of accessing the lumbar spine with less trauma. This was identified from our registry, so now it allowed us to ask a clinical question. Can we set up a study that compares midline to Wilsey approach, and does it make a difference to infection rates? And we published a comparative study of over 100 patients in each group, and we found that we had no infections in the midline splitting approach. So we eliminated surgical site infection in 1 or 2 level degenerative lumbar spine by changing our surgical approach. We would never have known that had we not done the registry work to identify the risk factors for our infections, and then we were able to institute this clinical this change in practice, which has reduced our surgical site infection rate. We also identified that a post-surgical or post-admission urinary tract infection had an odds ratio of over 5 of a patient developing a surgical site infection. So eliminate your urinary tract infections and you'll dramatically reduce your risk of surgical site infection. Our hospital was on a initiative for early catheter removal. We showed that it wasn't appropriate in patients with traumatic spinal cord injury. In fact, that it was inappropriate because it led to an increase in urinary tract infection rate. And with that and a number of other initiatives, we've dramatically reduced our surgical site infection rate across the board, and that reduction has been maintained since about 2012 or 2013. All because we were able to identify problems with care through registry data that allowed the development of quality initiatives. The hardware malposition requiring revision, by demonstrating that this was the second most common reason for readmission or for reoperation, we could advocate to our local foundation for funds to purchase an intraoperative navigation system, which led to a dramatic reduction in screw malposition, a significant reduction in reoperation for symptomatic screw malposition, a dramatic reduction in radiation exposure to the surgical staff. And we showed that if you operate on more than 250 patients in a year, instrumented spine cases, this type of technology can be cost saving. Another powerful argument to use for funders as far as funding your ongoing registry work. There are a number now of international sites that are using this system, and this adverse event system forms the basis of our spine outcomes research network. I would say that finally, in the nuts and bolts of the registry, keep the reporting system going, and that requires that leadership, it requires that buy-in. If you've made all that effort at the beginning, then, like I said at the start, you won't back out because you've invested yourself in that process. And we annually produce reports on aspects of quality of care, disparity in care, cost effectiveness, clinical cost utility. And so I would summarize by saying have a strong mandate, choose your team wisely, clearly define your objectives, spend time defining a minimum data set, partner with somebody who has the technological ability to provide you with the support that you need for the registry, start with a pilot to prove the concept, and then keep the reporting system going primarily to result in quality improvement initiatives. Thank you very much.